All right, folks, my microphone is on, so and it is 5 till, so let's get started. Welcome to the last session of the day. Hopefully we'll be able to get this done, get you folks out, so we can go to the 2 parties tonight, which is why everybody comes to conferences anyway. My name is Bill Heinzman, and I work for a company in Boulder, Colorado called JaneBridge, and we specialize in Java to .NET interoperability. It's nice being in San Jose. It's cooler than in Colorado, and it's not on fire, and that's a big plus. So what JaneBridge focuses on is essentially making interoperability go away. So you don't have to concentrate on the mechanism of interoperability. It's a way to code in one framework, either Java or .NET, without having to worry about the fact that there actually may be Java objects, but they have a tendency to look like .NET objects to you and vice versa. So the whole idea is to make the complexity of cross-platform interoperability to go away. At the same time, preserving the technology that your companies have invested in. So if you're a .NET house and don't know much about Java, you'll be pleased to note that you'll be able to code in .NET and C#, even though it's really Java objects that are in the background, but they look like .NET objects. Relevant product we're going to talk about today is JaneBridge Pro. JaneBridge has been around since 2001 when .NET was in beta, and we've got a lot of customers around the world using our product to bridge the gap. So what are we going to talk about today? I'm going to talk about, narrow it down, I'm going to talk about interoperability between Hadoop running on Linux in an analysis application or a query application or some kind of front end to the Hadoop stack that's running on Windows. And this really means 2 different platforms, 2 different operating systems, but it really means interoperability between Java running on Linux and .NET running on Windows. Yes, there's mono. We're not going to be talking about mono today. We're going to be concentrating really just on the front end for Hadoop running on .NET, C#, Windows. The Hadoop clusters are actually running on Linux. So this is not about HD Insight at all. I believe that there are some Microsoft folks up here. I think most of them are actually about an hour north of here at the Build conference. But there is information on HD Insight if you're so interested. But I hope that everybody here has their Hadoop implementations running on Linux. And we're going to talk about why we care about interoperability. That's really kind of an obvious one. Talk about if we care about interoperability, why can't we just do it very simply? I'm being a little bit facetious when I say scripts, SSH, and comma separated values. Talk about what's currently in Hadoop. Talk about that interoperability can be hard to do or it can be easy to do, but orthogonal to that, if it's very easy to do, it actually may not be scalable or maintainable, or it has the ability to evolve as a corporation evolves its data needs. We'll do a little show and tell, and then we're going to have a Q&A. So last few Hadoop conferences, there was a lot of talk about integrating Hadoop to the enterprise. Really what this means is taking advantage of an enterprise's information and making Hadoop successful. It's not always true that big data is going to equal big answers. At the same time, you don't necessarily want to completely restructure all of your silos of expertise. You may have .NET, you may have Java, you may have, for lack of a better term, data scientists, and then you have the people who actually want to make the queries and move an enterprise in a particular direction, business analysis, if you will. Generally, those are 2 separate functions, and the people who do the business analysis, who are asking the questions, aren't necessarily people who can code up MapReduce jars, for example. They may be people who know what kind of queries they make, but SQL stymies them, and they don't know how to put it in terms of SQL. At the same time, you have your data scientists who, as a software engineer, I can tell you from lots of experience that I really didn't care about what the companies I worked for were selling. It was kind of like Dilbert. What does your company do? Well, we sell something that's beige and uses electricity. I'd be the last person to actually try to make business decisions on big data. Leverage the common experience. This is really important. And also all the things that software managers want. They want something that's quick to prototype, quick to develop and deploy. It's easy to maintain, it's scalable, and it can evolve. You can do different versions of it as your company's needs grow. So integrating Hadoop to the enterprise really means integrating Hadoop to the desktop. Now, of course, an hour north of here, that's what Microsoft is telling everybody in terms of de facto, but it's true. So the people who are going to be asking the questions of the big data in order to get the big answers that are going to increase shareholder value and revenue, those are the people who have Windows on their desk. They don't necessarily want to be involved with looking at shells or writing scripts or writing MapReduce jars. They're not scientists. There was a talk earlier today about climate research in NASA. And the comment was that the people doing the analysis were comfortable writing MapReduce jars. Well, they're scientists, so they ought to be. But in a lot of organizations, the people who actually, I met very talented business people who can really make a difference in corporations, but technology is not their strong suit. So the desktop provides all of these tools. They provide tools for query and for analysis, Excel being an obvious one. Again, coming back to scripts, SSH and comma-separated values, yeah, you can get it done, but it's not a very good solution. So interoperability means doing glue. It means actually worrying about some of the details before you can actually start worrying about implementing something that's going to provide value. Parenthetically, I have currently up there. So there might be some announcements or some classes that I have or talks I haven't gone to today that may obviate parts of this slide here, but this generally is what interoperability that currently exists in the Hadoop stack. Obviously, the big one is ODBC. So Hive supports SQL 92. I believe Cassandra has a SQL-like interface as well. And so if there's an ODBC driver that exists, then interoperability kind of comes for free at that particular point. Any application that's running on Windows, you can plug a data source in and start making queries against, you're there already. The other one is Thrift. And Thrift doesn't really support C#. I've looked at some of the Apache web pages, and there's talk about C#. Some of the Hadoop stack does have Thrift servers that support C++, and of course, if you take that C++ and compile it correctly, you can do the com interop thing and actually call it from .NET. The whole point, though, is that you're still getting bogged down in the details of implementing the interoperability rather than having that happen automatically, and so you can concentrate on actually implementing something that provides value. So I don't know if anybody's done major construction on their house, but you don't want your carpenters worrying for 3 weeks what kind of hammer they're going to use. You want them to actually start building something. Also, Thrift servers tend to be implemented separately. There's a Hive Thrift server. Other parts of the Hadoop stack have other Thrift servers as well. Templeton, I didn't see anything on Templeton in terms of talks here. That's currently under development. Hadoop streaming, again, a little low level. And then finally, roll your own. Yes, you can go ahead and do lots of things in terms of doing REST or web services or even scripts, SSH and comma-separated values. So let's talk about JaneBridge Pro. So it's really a solution that creates proxies of the objects that exist in one framework. We're going to be talking about calling Java from .NET. So what happens is there's a development stage where you can take a bunch of jar files, you look in those jar files and choose the namespaces or even the individual classes that you want to have proxied in .NET. At the end of that development, you'll actually have an assembly that's full of .NET objects that are proxies for the actual Java objects. And so the .NET proxies run in the CLR, the Java objects run in the JVM, and when you create an instance of one of the proxies, you end up creating an instance of that Java object in the JVM. When you call a method on the proxy, you end up calling that method in the Java object. JaneBridge Pro handles all of the data conversions and types for you. What it does is it provides you a very rich API. I mean, you can have Java APIs that return objects. You'll end up with that object in the CLR. You can invoke methods on that object. You can use objects as arguments. You can even have a Java interface that you can implement in .NET and then use as an argument when you call a method in one of the .NET proxies. This is a way of having a very rich, there's really no limitations. So any API that's public in the Hadoop stack, you can actually proxy with JaneBridge Pro. The communication between the JVM and the CLR can be done in shared memory. So you've got a process running on Windows. There is a JVM instanced in that process, and all of the Java objects are in that JVM along with the CLR. Garbage collection is handled seamlessly between the two frameworks as well. Also, there is supported geographically remote. In other words, the JVM can be running on the Linux box and the CLR can be running on the Windows box. We support a proprietary TCP binary protocol between the two frameworks, between the JVM and the CLR, as well as SOAP going over HTTP or HTTPS. So as an example of this, I'm going to show how to build kind of an Excel front end for HBase MapReduce. We chose HBase because there isn't a SQL front end to HBase. Well, there's not a SQL front end yet to HBase. I mean, if you think about it, doing a filter in a MapReduce is really a select order group by count, right? So yeah, you can go ahead and come up with a SQL query that matches just about anything, including the NoSQL stuff. But in this particular case, it doesn't quite exist yet. So the idea was, can you build an Excel front end for HBase such that you could actually perform queries on a particular data set? So we've got Linux running HBase Hadoop. We have the HBase and Hadoop client. So HBase has a concept of a client, and there are actually admin classes as well that allow you to remotely configure and to instance tables and to create tables on one machine when the Hadoop cluster is on a group of other machines. So in this case, HBase has its own client. And by the way, Thrift is not actually used for the HBase client. And so we go through JaneBridge Pro. We've got the proxies of the HBase and Hadoop library proxies. And then we use the Visual Studio tools for Office, which are a very nice set of tools that Microsoft has had around for a while that allow you to build actually fairly sophisticated applications in Microsoft Office. The most notably, VSTO is primarily used for Outlook and Excel, not so much for Word or the other Microsoft applications. So the first step would be development, which is to gather up all the jar files that constitute everything that you would need for the HBase client as well as the HBase configuration namespaces. And there's a whole slew of them here. So you would essentially create a class path, if you will. It really is a class path. And then you have the ability through reflection to expose all of the namespaces and all of the classes that are in those jar files. The bottom dialog shows the proxy generator. So we can actually choose an entire namespace. You can see that over in the right-hand pane on that bottom screenshot is actually showing through reflection. I believe that's actually the HBase client HTable class. So what happens is that you can choose any of the namespaces or classes that are in the jar files, and you can then add them, and what will happen is JaneBridge Pro will walk through entire dependencies. It will find all the classes that are aggregated in a particular class, all the classes that are returned from methods, or all the classes that are actually arguments for those methods. If it can't find a class someplace in the jar files, it will let you know, and that tells you that you need to go back and find out where those classes are actually implemented in the jar files in the Hadoop stack. The JaneBridge Pro also gives you a bunch of tools to actually search through jar files so you can actually find particular classes, and then you just add those jar files to the class path and then regenerate all of the proxies. At the end of this, you end up with an assembly. And in this case, for this particular example, the resulting proxy assembly will contain 1,085 Java classes. This includes mundane stuff like everything in java.lang and java.util as well. So at this point, you would just go in, and in Visual Studio, JaneBridge Pro has a nice plugin for Visual Studio. So you would create your proxy assembly. You would reference it as a project in your actual Visual Studio Tools for Office project. And then you would start coding. So to be extremely pedantic, you will notice that it says using followed by org.apache, all those namespaces. It's not import, it's actually using. So you can see that this is C# code. Looks like Java. You know, we did a Venn diagram between Java and C#. You'd have a pretty good overlap. But this is all .NET C#. So in this case, they're actually coding against the Java APIs, HBase APIs. In this particular example, make a very simple Windows form. And the idea is that you connect to a particular Hadoop cluster, actually connect to Zookeeper. And you have the ability to just view a subset of the records that exist in that big table. You can choose to filter, and HBase has a whole set of scans and filters that allow you to initially reduce the data before you go into the map reduce. What you need to do is write kind of a Java wrapper. So now we were looking at C# code. Now we're back to looking at Java code. So this is just a standard HBase using the HBase mapper and reducer templates. And this is just a very simple wrapper in Java that makes a generic way to actually take a data set and specify what, I'm going to use the word columns for HBase for the big table, but families and columns in terms of what data you want to select, and then essentially what you want to reduce on. So essentially, this is just simple frequency counts, right? So this is Java. You end up making a jar file. You go back to the previous 2 slides ago using the proxy tool, and you generate .NET proxies for this Java wrapper you wrote around HBase MapReduce, so that you can now call MapReduce from .NET, actually from your Visual Studio project, where you're building this front end in Excel. And here is just the, I believe that's the handler for the button MapReduce. And you can see that it, the columns that you've chosen here. So this is details.ip. Details is the family. IP is actually the column. This is a very simple data set that was used for this example. It wasn't real data, but you know, you get the idea. And in this particular case, it actually is able to set up the I apologize for the size of the font on that, but you can actually see that it actually is running through the data and running the MapReduce, and then pulling the data, the results of the MapReduce, and MapReduce results, of course, are put into another big table. It's just bringing that data and populating an Excel spreadsheet, an Excel grid. And there is the result. So this is a very simple way of just showing that using the tool, it's very simple to quickly have interoperability between Hadoop on Linux and Windows. Now in this case we were using the HBase client, so actually on Windows the HBase jar files. Don't have to do that. You can use any API that's in the Hadoop stack, such that if that API literally needs to live on the Hadoop Linux cluster, in this case then you would use a different communication. You would use the TCP binary. So you basically have the equivalent of a server running on the Hadoop Linux cluster that would load in all of the jar files that you have created the .NET proxies for. So Excel then could be running on somebody's Windows desktop, and all the jar files, all the JVM is actually running on a Linux machine someplace. And instead of shared memory, this example uses shared memory, of course, because now the jar files for the HBase client actually can live on the Windows machine. But in the case where you're using TCP binary or SOAP, they can be geographically separate. What's nice about this is that you can actually create one very large server that will serve multiple APIs in the Hadoop stack. It's not necessary to create one server for each API. You can create a very large server. Also, when you're going through TCP IP between the CLR and the JVM, there you can specify thread affinity, so that there is a one-to-one mapping between threads in the CLR and threads in the JVM. And that solves some things. I believe that many parts of the Hadoop stack, the APIs aren't particularly thread safe. I know that HBase actually, HTable implementation, the HBase client is not thread safe. Let's stop there. Any questions or comments? Come on, don't be bashful. All right. You don't need to read the paragraph. That paragraph is there when these slides are on SlideShare, so somebody can know what's going on. And looking at SlideShare for previous Hadoop conferences, I see slides that are nothing but non sequiturs. It's kind of hard to tell what's going on. But in this case, this is sort of a synopsis of the value of JaneBridge Pro. And of course, these particular labs for the Excel add-in can be found online, as well as all of the source for what I just showed you can actually be downloaded, including the Eclipse project as well as the Visual Studio project. There's also a previous lab that shows integrating HBase into Link, so that you can have a SQL-like front end to HBase, essentially select, order, group by, and count. Thanks for listening. Yes?
There we go. Your use case obviously showed HBase. When I was down at the Tableau, the demonstration, they had a number of examples of accessing Hive.
Right.
And so would you offer an alternative or added value implementation for connecting to Hive as opposed to HBase?
Well, it depends on how you're accessing Hive. If you're accessing the SQL front end to Hive, ODBC is going to work just fine. And it doesn't, you know, if you can actually have Excel, you can go ahead and download the ODBC driver. You can configure the data source, and that will work fine if you've got the Hive Thrift server running someplace. It doesn't need to be running on HD Insight. It can be running on your Linux cluster. However, if you want to access other parts of the Hive API, perhaps not query, perhaps actually building up the data, you know, all of that, then this would be an alternative to that. Would be an alternative. I don't know exactly in terms of the Hive Thrift server how much has been exposed. I do know that you know, as a software engineer who used to be a manager, that I can tell you is that I really would prefer engineers to use something that makes it a little more simple rather than trying to roll your own on top of Thrift. So yes, this could be an alternative if you're accessing other parts of Hive besides just the query front end through SQL. But any Hadoop API, whether it's HDFS, whether it's Hive or HBase or any part of it, can be proxied into .NET. So we're not, in this particular example, we're talking about analysis, but it could be any part of the Hadoop stack. Even the data guys who are in charge of actually taking the data and putting it into a cluster, who are in charge of writing the scripts, writing the MapReduce jars, all of that, that could also be brought over into Windows, into a particular application that already exists, or in terms of a roll your own application that's written on top of WPF or Windows Forms, something like that. So the whole point being is that interoperability is just something that should happen. Shouldn't be any sandboxes, but unfortunately there are sandboxes. And so the product is just a way of making that go away. Also, what's very nice about it is if you're a complete .NET house, and you've got some Java guys over there, but you have these silos of expertise and you really don't communicate, it's a way of simplifying things. In other words, you can actually just tell the guys, take this jar file, invoke it on Linux with this class path at this particular point, and that's the server. That's the Java side for the .NET application. So it's a way of, this gets back to a previous line that was in one of the previous slides, is maintain but manage those silos of expertise. You know, in the perfect world, everybody would know everything. You wouldn't have silos, but that's not going to happen. You've got your .NET software engineers, you've got your Java software engineers, you have your data scientists, you have the people who are in charge of trying to ask questions of the data in order to make business decisions. Any other questions? All right. Thanks very much. Oh, yeah, we got one.
Under your summer.
You just gotta get closer.
Closer? Okay, fine. You wrote any Hadoop stack API can be. Now, can I drop the word? Any stack API can be proxied to .NET.
So you're saying can any API be...
Forget about Hadoop. So it's mean that your company provide the connection with any jar file.
Any jar file, any API. It's not just Hadoop.
Specific example or subset.
This is just a specific example, and this was actually driven by a customer. You know, we had a customer buy it, and we finally got around doing support for them, and they said, oh, we're building a front end on .NET for Hadoop. It's kind of like, oh, Hadoop, we kind of heard about that, and started to do research on it, and it turned out it was a very big thing. Within the last month, it's become a real big thing. So, but yeah, any jar file. Also, as well as you can go the other way. If you got a .NET assembly, you can create Java proxies and go the other way. You can also do bidirectional as well and proxy both sides. What happens is that